You'll love that.
Download our app today and enjoy tackle-busting benefits with great odds, more markets and same-game multi every NRL match at Palmerbet. Gamble responsibly. For Gamblers' Help, call 1-800-858-858.
Welcome everybody to episode 419 of Fergo and the Freak. I'm your host, the Glorious League Freak. This is our NRL Round 18 preview. But first I want to talk about the weird situation at the West Tigers that has unfolded over the last probably about 48 hours now. So it has been confirmed, the Tigers coaching situation. Tim Sheens will coach the West Tigers until 2025. His assistant coaches will be Robbie Farah and Benji Marshall. After 2025, Benji Marshall will then be the head coach of the West Tigers. Benji Marshall has been given a 5-year deal, so that includes him being an assistant coach and then being a head coach at the club. And I don't know what the hell is this whole thing's about. It is so weird. It is so ridiculous. Keep in mind that when Tim Sheens was brought to the West Tigers by the board and the CEO, his job was mainly to set up the junior development pathways, which haven't worked at the West Tigers for a long time now. And he was to do a review of the entire club. Now, the outcome of that review was that he felt that the club needed stability, that they were unable to get good free agents on the market, in the player market, because there was this uncertainty about their coaching situation. So the way that they've remedied that at the West Tigers is that they sacked Michael Maguire pretty much immediately and then put in an interim coach in Brett Camorley just until the end of this year. And then Tim Sheens is the best candidate for the role from that point on. Just ask him. And then after Tim Sheens is there, it will go to Benji Marshall, who at this point has no top grade coaching experience. By then he'll have 3 years of being an assistant coach. But as we've said on the podcast before, you never know how somebody is going to go as a head coach in the NRL until they do the job. There's just no way to predict it. You can be, the greatest rugby league minds in the world. You do not know how somebody is going to react to being a head coach in the NRL. You just don't. Hopefully Benji Marshall is a great rugby league coach. He's got plenty of experience as a player. He was a great player. But we've seen great players don't necessarily translate to be great coaches. If anything, they're, for the most part, not good coaches because they were great players. There's also the thing that hangs over this whole situation where one day you've got to sack Benji Marshall. Like, Benji Marshall is not going to be the head coach of the West Tigers for forever. And I've talked about this a little bit where I don't like seeing former greats take over a club because eventually you've got to sack them. And eventually it all ends pretty poorly. And it's kind of hard to mend fences after that with a great player. I think that the best situation where we've seen that, where a fence has been mended, is with Royce Simmons at the Penrith Panthers, where he was the head coach for a little bit. And they had to sack him at one point. It's not a good situation. Nobody wants to see the West Tigers have to sack Benji Marshall somewhere down the line. I also think for Benji Marshall, if he has an eye on being a first-grade head coach, the worst club you could do it at would be the West Tigers. I know he loves the West Tigers. He wants them to do well, but still, it's a very, very weird situation where the Tigers' perfect, ideal, best-case scenario, everything works to plan, is that they go Maguire, Camorley, then Tim Sheens again, because he says he's the best guy for the job, and then he will step down at a designated moment and give it to Benji Marshall. That is weird. That is really, really weird. Who's to say Tim Sheens is going to finish his entire time when he takes over the role? He's been sacked before. They might sack him again. The West Tigers love sacking a coach. And then there's also the spectre of Robbie Farah in all this, who, the weird thing was that Michael Maguire had Robbie Farah running water, and we had that story that Robbie Farah was saying stuff about Maguire while he was running water. Didn't think much about that. Then Maguire gets sacked. Brett Camorley gets brought in, and all of a sudden Robbie Farah's up there in the coaching box. And Brett Camorley just gets thrown to the wolves. No one's saying anything about Brett Camorley. He's going to do the job this year, and then they don't care about him at the West Tigers anymore. But then, what are the chances that Robbie Farah allows Benji Marshall to be the West Tigers coach before him? I reckon it's pretty slim. The idea that this is all going to work out for the West Tigers is very weird. It's a weird situation. I think this whole setup is ludicrous. I think that if Tim Sheens had have sat me down personally and said, this is my plan, I would have listened to his plan and then thanked him for his time and then asked him to leave the club and gone in a completely different direction, because this situation is a pre-planned mess, and only a terrible club, a horrible club that is poorly run with no direction, no leadership, would give the green light to something so utterly stupid. I'm sorry if you're a West Tigers fan and you're listening to this. You must get sick of us talking about how bad your club is. But honestly, what do you think as a West Tigers fan if you're looking at the club through this entire situation? Where's the light at the end of the tunnel? Is it that hopefully Benji Marshall takes over one day and everything's okay in 2025 and beyond? On top of that, they gave him a 5-year deal to an assistant coach who will then become your head coach. Hopefully. How much money do they have to spend on paying people out? We joke about the West Tigers books being balanced, but how good are their finances that they can keep paying these former coaches and just handing out 5-year deals? It's such a weird situation. I don't know what to think about it, but I had to talk about it on the podcast. I feel sorry when I talk to Andrew about it, because he goes into some PTSD, NAM flashbacks when we talk about it. What can you say? I feel sorry for West Tigers fans. I really do. It's an absolutely terrible club that has no direction at all. Now let's look at the upcoming games for round 18 in the NRL, thanks to our sponsors Palmerbet. You can go to palmerbet.com for all of these prices I'm about to say. Palmerbet's our sponsor this year, and they've been fantastic with us. Remember, always gamble responsibly. Now, the first game of the round sees the North Queensland Cowboys host the Cronulla Sharks. The Cowboys are slight favourites at $1.87, with the Sharks at $1.93. The line has been set with the Sharks getting a 1.5 point head start. There's been a little bit of money there for the Sharks. They're into $1.86, while with the 1.5 point handicap, the North Queensland Cowboys are at $1.95. Now, the North Queensland Cowboys are going to have to deal with some players coming back from Origin, so that's something to take into account. There's going to be a bit of a letdown after Origin for some of those players, I would suggest, but I tend to think that because Queensland won, it'll be something that makes them play better. And the Sharks have been a little bit shaky over the last month or so. So I'm going to tip the North Queensland Cowboys in that game. It should be a good game, though. It should really show us where both teams are coming out of the Origin series. Look, they'll both be wanting to get wins really quickly after Origin, because now you can cement yourself in that top 8. I think that we could easily see a separation from the top 8 teams and the bottom 8 teams, depending on how the next couple of weeks go. So we'll see how that all plays out. The next game sees the Parramatta Eels taking on the New Zealand Warriors. Now, believe it or not, the Parramatta Eels are favourites in this one. They are on Palmerbet at $1.14, while the New Zealand Warriors in the head-to-head at $5.80. the New Zealand Warriors have a huge 17.5 point head start at $1.90, and with the 17.5 point handicap, the Parramatta Eels are also at $1.90. Can't go past the Eels in this one. The New Zealand Warriors are an absolute mess of a club right now. The Eels didn't have too many players involved in State of Origin, so that will help them. But yeah, this is a really easy one to pick. The Warriors are just all over the place right now. It's weird. What will be the end of their year? Like, do they develop players at this point going forward? Because they're not going to make the finals. So that's what I would look to do, develop young players. That means dropping Sean Johnson. And they're not going to do that for some reason. We've seen Johnson can be the worst player in the NRL, and they're not going to drop him. So that's that game covered. In the next match, we have the Sydney City Roosters taking on the St George Illawarra Dragons. Palmerbet has the Roosters as favourites at $1.35 in the head-to-head. If you want to put money on the Dragons, it's $3.23. The Dragons have an 8.5 point head start at $1.90, while the Sydney Roosters have an 8.5 point handicap also at $1.90. This game's a little bit interesting. The Roosters should win it, right? The Roosters should win it. But the Dragons can come up and have a decent go of it against some teams in the NRL. And we saw Ben Hunt, he was fantastic in Origin. It's going to be interesting to see how he comes back in and plays in this game. Look, I'm tipping the Roosters in this one as well. But, the Dragons, I think if it's just one of those games where if it's the Dragons' day, they could nab the win. So it's going to be an interesting game to watch. The next match, we have the Manly Seagulls taking on the Newcastle Knights. This used to be the old rivalry. We'll probably see a bunch of videos that they show from 30 years ago of when both of these teams were relevant at the same time. Now, on Palmerbet.com, the Manly Warringah Seagulls are favourites at $1.34. The Newcastle Knights are at $3.29. The Newcastle Knights have an 8.5 point handicap. An 8.5 point head start at $1.90. And with the 8.5 point handicap, the Manly Warringah Seagulls are also at $1.90. Now, keep in mind, this will be played at Brookvale Oval. The ground is sour at Brookvale Oval. We all know why on this podcast. Can't go past Manly in this one. I think that the Knights, once again, kind of like the New Zealand Warriors, the Knights are just a mess of a club. I would be, once again, looking to just get their juniors going towards the end of this year. They're not going to make the finals either. They've had a terrible year. They need a new coach. And, Manly really should put them away. And this would be a really important 2 points for Manly. They can't let that 2 points get away from them. Now, on to the next match. We see the Gold Coast Titans taking on the Brisbane Broncos. On Palmerbet.com, the Gold Coast Titans are at $2.98. So the Brisbane Broncos at favourites are at $1.40 in the head-to-head. The Gold Coast Titans have a 7.5 point head start at $1.90, while with the 7.5 point handicap on Palmerbet.com, the Brisbane Broncos are also at $1.90. I think the difference here is Adam Reynolds. The talent-wise, they're not too different, these clubs, while the Broncos have been going a little bit better this year. And you've got the Titans who just fall apart, like Justin Holbrook. What's he doing as a coach? I've tipped the Broncos in this one. I think that, it's an away game, but it's not that far away. The Gold Coast is a pretty quick trip for the Broncos, and they really should get the points here just with Adam Reynolds guiding them around the park. Now we move on to the supposed Battle of the West, where the West Tigers, now that their future is sorted, they host the defending world and NRL champion Penrith Panthers. Now, the Panthers have rested pretty much all of their Origin players for this one. I wouldn't be shocked if some of them ended up in the lineup, but I don't know which ones. It's going to be interesting to see. But anyway, on Palmerbet.com, the West Tigers are outsiders for this one. Shock horror. They're at $3.10. The Penrith Panthers are at $1.37. I think I'd take that still. I'm still tipping the Panthers in this one. The West Tigers have an 8.5 point head start at $1.90. And with the 8.5 point handicap, the Panthers are also at $1.90. Even if they don't name their origin players, when you look at the Panthers lineup, it's still a very, very good lineup. They really, as a club, should be aiming for this to be a one of those games that they just say, look, we're the premiers. We've been through this origin situation before. We know what we're doing. We should win this game. Also couple that with how poorly the West Tigers are playing. Like, when you look at it from a talent point of view, they're probably not the same team as the Panthers, even that are running out in the field this weekend. But just when you look at their form on top of that, it just adds to the fact that you should probably tip the Panthers in that one. I know I am. On to the next game. Palmerbet.com has us watching the Melbourne Storm versus the Canberra Raiders. The Melbourne Storm are favourites on Palmerbet.com at $1.25, while the Raiders are at $4. That's a pretty good price. When you consider that the Melbourne Storm, their form has been a little bit iffy. I know it's been played down in Melbourne, but still $4, that's pretty good. Now, the Raiders have an 11.5 point head start, which is also fantastic on Palmerbet.com. You can get $1.90 for that. With the 11.5 point handicap, the Melbourne Storm are also at $1.90. I don't know what to make of the Raiders at the moment. They're a little bit all over the place. It's a bit of a transitional year. You know, they brought in a lot of youngsters. They got rid of some of the crap that was holding the team back. And I just think it's a transitional year for them. And credit to Ricky Stewart for seeing how poor the Raiders were early on and making changes. He really needed to do that. It was long overdue. The Storm, meanwhile, look, I think that they're just treading water through Origin. Now the Origin's over, we'll see where they really stand. But I don't think they're quite as good as they have been the last couple of years. It doesn't mean that they're not a premiership threat. I just think that they're just not quite where they have been before. Keep in mind they don't have Smith, who's been suspended for calling the referee cheating bastard. That was a really smart move on his behalf. Now we move on to the next game where we have the Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs taking on the South Sydney Rabbitohs. Palmerbet.com has the Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs as outsiders at $3.25. The Rabbitohs are favourites at $1.35. Now, you can get 8.5 point head start for the Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs at $1.90. With the 8.5 point handicap, the Rabbitohs are also at $1.90. Hard to go past the Rabbitohs here. I know the Bulldogs have been playing a lot better since they made the coaching change away from Trent Barrett, but with Latrell Mitchell back, you should see the Rabbitohs playing a little bit better. They've got more threats on the park, and maybe he can help fix that problem where their halves just are not linking up at all. Maybe he can be a link between the two of them. Who knows? But it's going to be interesting to see if Latrell actually gets through the entire final series, and because he's become a player that has missed big chunks of important parts of the Rabbitohs season, unfortunately. And look, there've been a couple of silly injuries that, just happen to football players, but there's also been a couple of catastrophic injuries, and then there's been suspensions, and it's like, Latrell Mitchell can't be on the sideline that much if the Rabbitohs are going to do any good, especially for how much he's on there at the Rabbitohs. So I'm tipping the Rabbitohs in that one. They should get the win, but you never know with this Bulldogs team. Like, they're getting better and better. I said at the start of the year, I think they'd start slow and they would get better and better as the season went on. If they win this game, it's going to be really interesting to see if they can get on a little bit of a roll. But we'll see. That's why they play the games. Anyway, short episode this one. We'll try and do an episode before Monday's episode, but we'll wait and see on that one. we're back into the normal NRL regular season grind now, and we go through to the end of the year. So there's something cool in that. I kind of like the regular schedule that we have for the podcast, because Origin is fantastic. It's awesome, all of that stuff, but it does mess up our schedule so much. So that's why you're getting this so late in the piece. And from now on, our previews for the rounds will be on Tuesday, latest Wednesday. Anyway, thank you for listening. Tell your friends to listen. Quick episode. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Palmerbet with the big don't argue. Punters will love that. Download our app today and enjoy tackle busting benefits with great odds, more markets and same game multi every NRL match at Palmerbet. Gamble responsibly. For Gamblers' Help, call 1-800-858-858.